the disappearance of civil liberties, the ABBOTT coalition agenda. So, for the first time in a long time, politics in the pub is guilty of false advertising. Because apparently it's Republican, I forget what the guy's name is, Turnbull. It's something, I think it's a universally important topic. I mean, it's referring to Australia, but having just spent 3 weeks in the Middle East, the disappearance of civil liberties is, in some ways, the word disappearance is false in itself, because it's as though civil liberties were once well entrenched there. The two speakers are in some ways household names in this city, or if not in this state. On Peter's right, but certainly not politically, is one of the most significant political voices in this state, David Shoebridge, who's a Greens MP in the upper house, and I wish he was in the Labour Party in many ways. I don't know whether David regards that as an insult.
I do, yes.
David's a barrister. David is such a good citizen that he's given up time to come here tonight on his birthday.
I'd like to first of all acknowledge that we're meeting tonight on the land of the Gadigal people and pay my respects to the elders past and present of the land we're meeting on. They have never ever ceded the sovereignty over this land, and we should all recognise that. I'd also like to thank Peter. I thought at the end he might have left me a couple of little patches of federal legislation that I could cover, but no, he had his list at the end just to tick them off, to just actually take the guts out of my speech. So really appreciate it. That was wonderful work. We're talking about, well, the notional topic is Abbott and authoritarianism and the attack on civil liberties, but of course it's really just the authoritarianism of executive government. Yeah. And it's this, the dominance of the executive that we have seen building up over the last decades, and the subservience of parliaments at a state and a federal level. What that produces is a regime of laws which are meant to be produced by democratically responsible parliaments, a regime of laws which are solely designed to suit the needs and the convenience of the executive. And really, we have government of the executive, by the executive, for the executive, at both the state and the federal level. And that is what has produced this torrent of attacks against our civil liberties, because the executive has no interest in people having civil liberties. And when you ask what is authoritarianism, well, authoritarianism is basically a group of powerfully centralised individuals with little, if any, control for any kind of democratic or pluralist feedback loop, who generate insecurity and fear and a known, at least one, hopefully two or three, identified but unbeatable enemies, and then use the oppressive machinery of the state in order to clamp down on their own citizens in an unwinnable war against these identifiable enemies. And that's kind of exactly what has happened in the 15 years, or the 14 years since September 11. You see, we had the end of the Cold War. That was great. But if you end the Cold War and you haven't got a readily identifiable enemy that you can devote huge amounts of resources to fighting, well, you have to start looking around for a fresh one. And really the one that was first pulled off the shelf by most executive governments after the Cold War in the Western world was the unwinnable war on drugs. And in large part that was a pretty good one, because it reached all levels of society. It produced a nice identifiable enemy which was causing harm, and there's undoubtable harm caused by illegal drugs, and you can see people with addiction, and within a criminalised legal regime, that addiction fosters crime, crime fosters violence, and therefore the state should respond to it. And the state responded to the war on drugs by vastly increasing our police forces, vastly increasing our border security, and beefing up the kind of criminal organisation laws the reach of the police into our ordinary daily existence in order to fight the war on drugs. And of course that's a great one because you can never win it, because human nature is human nature. People will always want to, there'll be a proportion of the population that will always want to be taking substances in order to change their mental perception of the world. And you know, with an Abbott government, that there'll be a greater number of people wanting to do that. You can't win it, and it was working really well. But there was kind of a bit of an international response that was kind of being generated that was looking at a different way of dealing with the problem of drugs. We saw Portugal moving in a particular direction. We've seen South America moving in a particular direction, and you can feel that if our entire security apparatus was being primarily ideologically enforced because of the war against drugs, that's kind of fraying a little. It's fraying at the edges. It's not a particularly good one. So along comes September 11. I'm not a conspiracy theorist when it comes to September 11. I don't believe that there was I don't believe there's evidence to suggest there was a deep underlying conspiracy that created September 11, but if you're an authoritarian government, you'd never let a good crisis go to waste. And what an amazing crisis that has proven to be for John Howard, who happened to be, floating around at the time in the US when September 11, the tragedy which is September 11 hit. And immediately he imported, through the federal parliament and through the laws that Peter spoke about, that initial knee-jerk response to terrorism, imported that crisis into Australia. And that is a wonderful threat. It beats the war on drugs in some ways, because you've got the sort of Rumsfeldian known knowns and known unknowns and unknown unknowns. and who can ever expunge the last unknown unknown? No security force can ever expunge the last unknown unknown. And suddenly the executive government, which wants to be in a position to expand its power, to militarise its police force, its customs officers, and produce things like a border force, or if you've noticed in New South Wales, the change in police uniform from a sort of 20th century garb to a 21st century paramilitary garb. If you want to see in the US the extraordinary paramilitarisation of their police forces, if you're a town of 10,000 or more citizens in the United States and you haven't managed to have a serious anti-terror squad with armoured cars and assault rifles ready to go, given to you free from US military surplus, well then you're not a town that anyone has any respect for. And that sounds funny, but it's not. It's the reality. That the militarised police in the US has got to an extraordinary level. Obama has made some very small changes in terms of the way that military surplus is disposed in the United States. It was literally unused military equipment was being given free of charge to state and local police forces to foster that militarisation of their police, and it's worked. It has absolutely worked. But that mentality was being applied by deputy sheriffs here in Australia at a state level, at our police forces, and federally. I mean, we've seen the creation of the border force out of our customs officers and our immigration officers, which used to be bureaucrats who were doing fairly mundane bureaucratic work in enforcing one of the safest borders in the world, and immigration bureaucrats who are dealing with one of the most isolated and hard to get to countries in the world, now suddenly all paramilitarised themselves. With a uniform you couldn't distinguish from a New South Wales police officer. So the terrorism threat has been an extraordinary gift to the executive government, and we're meant to have, in a Westminster system, when the executive is making these demands for more power, for increased resources, for increased surveillance, to have unlimited warrantless access to all of your metadata, to propose a blanket silencing on the officials that are undertaking duties, whether as doctors or psychologists or nurses or social workers in refugee camps and compounds that we establish. We're meant to have a parliament that looks at and holds the executive to account. But for the last 15 years, we've not had a single parliament at a state or a federal level that has ever sought to seriously hold an executive to account at any level. And it is a fundamental dysfunction in the way our political system operates. If anyone's had the misfortune to watch a question time, actually go to Parliament and watch a question time, or had the misfortune to really look closely at how these bills pass through parliaments, and the lack of academic or intellectual scrutiny that's applied in the parliamentary debates, as they're being rubber stamped through the lower house, where the government knows it has a majority, the executive knows it has a majority, and doesn't have to convince anybody. And they don't even try. They don't even make the argument, a viable argument, other than there's a threat of terror, there's a threat of drugs, there's a threat, and we're responding to it. We've seen something, now we're saying something, as Peter would say. This amorphous threat is being responded to, and don't you dare stand up and say a word against it. And that is what has produced this raft of laws. And if you wanted to see the absolute nadir of our parliamentary system, I think if you look at the initial response that Bill Shorten gave to that border farce, if you remember the border farce, the media release that was sent twice to the Border Force Minister's office, and he failed to ever read, which said that they were going to be doing the random checks of foreign-looking people on the streets of Melbourne. A genius idea, and actually that was a bit of jumping the shark. That was actually a little too far. That was the Fonz on a motorbike going a little too far. That was jumping the shark. But it was jumping the shark in the eyes of the broader public. But what did our opposition leader, the federal opposition leader, do when that was first raised with him? It was first raised with him in a radio interview at about a little bit after midday or so, when it had been brought to his attention and this media release had come out that the border force, the new paramilitary border force, was going to be doing random checks, standing side by side with the Victorian police. His initial response was, we have a significant problem with illegal migrants. We have a significant problem with 457 migrant workers, and we need to make sure we have a close eye on whether or not these foreign workers are stealing the jobs of locals and Australians. And that's a matter that I think is serious and we should be closely looking into. That's a summary of his initial response on radio. And to which the radio shock jock said, yes, absolutely, of course. And he got out of the studio, and then all hell was breaking loose in the broader media about it, and it became apparent that that completely supine response, ignoring our civil liberties, had finally, at some point, elicited a public outcry. And then he wound it back and said, oh, actually, no, we don't support random checks. And how terrible of the government. How could they ever have thought this was a good idea to be doing these random checks on the streets? It should never happen. It should never happen. Well, of course it should have never happened. But when you have a lack of checks and balances, a parliament that isn't doing its job, that isn't holding the executive to account, you get that. And you can see how the government of the day continues to test the boundaries. And there is often in the political debate, and it happened in the original terrorism laws that passed through in 2001 and 2002 at a state and federal level, the executive said to Parliament, well, we need these laws. We need these laws to deal with this terror threat. And we understand that there might be some bleeding heart lefties in the Parliament that will have some concerns with these terror laws. So don't you worry. Don't you worry, we'll put a sunset clause in them. And these laws will lapse after 5 years, 3 years, but normally 5 years. These laws will lapse after 5 years unless they're freshly validated by you, this wonderful democratic organ that is the federal parliament or the state parliament. And almost every one of these changes has had a sunset clause like that in them. And that's the sop that they give to the parliament at the time to say, of course we're concerned about civil liberties, and of course we're concerned, and we're giving you, a democratically elected organ, a chance to review these extraordinary increasing powers we're giving to the executive. There has not been a single occasion from research we have done since 2001 where a sunset clause has ever killed a power or in a bill. Ever. Not one occasion. Because every time they come up for review, the same fear is engendered, the same threats are raised, and on each occasion, either the sunset clause has been removed or it's just been rolled over for another 5 years. And it doesn't matter whether the government has been coalition government or a Labor government. No sun has ever set on a security provision. And the obvious international comparison are the emergency laws that the colonial government imposed in Malaya in the dying days of the English colonial administration in Malaya, which remain to this day on the statute books of Malaysia and used by the government in Malaysia. And in a similar way, the terrorism laws that were passed in 2001 and 2002 at a state and a federal level, with sunset clauses to deal with the terror of immediate urgency, I predict will remain on our statute books until such time as we rework our political system. Neither a state or a federal parliament, as presently constituted, will come close to removing them. I might just talk quickly, to lower the debate, and talk quickly about the little provincial government we have here in New South Wales as another illustration of the way in which the executive tail wags the dog of government, wags the dog that is the parliament. And to just have a little ellipse here, it's a remarkable thought that in New South Wales, and this is really showing where the whole debate is going. In New South Wales, the first law officer of the state is meant to be the Attorney General. And traditionally, we've had Attorney Generals like Jeff Shaw, or Bob Davis, people of, who have had some kind of integrity and a little bit of clout in the cabinet that have been able to sort of stand up and draw the line at some point, At least make the argument, a viable argument in cabinet to draw the line at some point. But our recent crop of Attorney Generals have been absolutely powerless. Our current Attorney General is my actual local member, Gabrielle Upton, and in case you didn't know, Gabrielle Upton is our Attorney General. She is essentially a powerless member of a relatively powerless faction within the Liberal Party, but put that to one side. The way that the government is structured in New South Wales is in these large clusters. And there's a justice and police cluster, which has a senior minister in it, and then a bunch of junior ministers in the justice and police cluster. And traditionally, in that cluster, you would have found the first law officer of the state, the one with the responsibility for the administration of our criminal laws and our courts, would be the senior officer in a justice cluster. But for most of the last 3 years, apart from a short window where Smith, when he was the Attorney General, insisted on a change, for most of the last 3 years, the senior minister in the Justice cluster has not been the Attorney General at all, but has been the Police Minister. Oh. And the Police Minister has been in charge of the Justice Ministry and has been ruling the roost in the Justice Ministry, and in fact, very recently, just definanced one of the last thin blue lines in the Justice Ministry, a part of the Justice Ministry that had actually been set up to actually look at the civil liberties and rights concerns that arose out of the series of never-ending demands from the police. Just been defunded and disbanded, and most of those senior officers who have been doing, an unsung job in the Justice Ministry have been made redundant just this year. So when you have the Police Minister leading the Justice cluster, and the Attorney General having to report to the Police Minister and and be the junior minister in it, it shows how far we have come, or how low we have sunk in terms of the essential authoritarian structures in our government of the day. And again, to draw a provincial example about how does this play out? Well, the war on drugs. The war on drugs is continuing to be fought. How do you fight an unwinnable war? Well, you fight it with PR. You fight it with a random application, well not quite random, a targeted application of the power of the state. So as you can get video on TV, you can have copy in the Daily Telegraph, you've got something to feed to the shock jocks, and drug dogs would be a great example of that. We had last year, in the order of 17,000 searches by drug dogs. Drug dogs who, after they have a positive indication that someone has a drug, is containing drugs, that empowers, in the eyes of the police, a police officer to do an immediate search upon you, demand you to empty out your pockets, empty out your bag, tip it out on the floor, and depending on the command, between 60% and 80% of the time, the drug dog is wrong. There are no drugs. And in about 600 occasions a year, sometimes 700 occasions a year, that search then escalates to a strip search, where they take the citizen to either a room at a railway station or a room at a music festival. They get the citizen to strip, and they get them to squat over a mirror, and they look up your backside and orifices for drugs. And again, you'd think that obviously before they escalated it to that, they had some kind of superior intelligence, but no, they're getting it wrong in those instances, again, between 60 and 70% of the time. And when they do find something, it's almost inevitably a tiny amount for possession, and somebody gets a warning. So why would you devote endless millions of dollars to this program? Why would you devote continuing resources to this program when you know it has an affected supply? Drug dealers, as a general rule, don't use their Opel card. They use they drive there in their Merc or their BMW. Drug dealers, as a general rule, aren't taking buckets of drugs to the gate of the dance party. It's totally ineffectual. Well, it's ineffectual if you want to ever win the war on drugs. It's ineffectual about dealing with the war on drugs, but it plays really well in lounge rooms on the nightly news. And it makes people feel like something is being done. And it justifies the use of police resources, and it expands the use of police resources. It ticks all the boxes of an authoritarian government. And that's why we have it. The other example that I would give is the consorting laws. The consorting laws passed through the New South Wales Parliament. It can be a crime if the police direct you not to meet with somebody, to talk with somebody, or send an email with somebody. If somebody has been convicted of an indictable offence, and increasingly with our draconian criminal justice system, an indictable offence can be a relatively, in the scheme of things, a relatively low-level offence, a drug dealing offence or an offence of some violence. If anyone's been convicted of an indictable offence, and the police think that they might be an ongoing problem, well, they can direct even a close family member, a friend or a colleague or just an acquaintance. They can issue them with a direction under the consorting laws and say, if you meet with, if you talk with, if you email, if you communicate with that person, then you are committing an offence under the consorting laws, and you are subject to up to 2 years in jail. You haven't committed any offence, no requirement that you commit an offence. There is a defence if it's reasonable, if you can prove reasonableness, if it's a close family member. So if it's your child or your father or your step-parent, you've got a defence, but it's not a defence as of right. You have to prove reasonableness as well. Those laws we were told those laws were essential to fight bikie gangs and to fight gun crime and drug crime and bikie gangs. That's why they passed through the Parliament. Well, the Ombudsman did a review of those laws at the end of the year before last, and there was in a number of commands in all of northwestern New South Wales, in a series of commands on the North Coast, up to 85% of consorting directions were issued against Aboriginal people. Not bikies. In fact, there hasn't been a case of a bikie going to jail for a breach of a consorting, but there was a mentally disabled person who identified as Aboriginal from a country town who was first jailed under these laws. Why do they do it? Well, they do it to expand the reach of the police. They do it to expand the reach and the power of our security apparatus. And time after time when these laws come through Parliament, whether it's mandatory sentencing, consorting, happens federally with the Greens on border force or dual citizenship, time after time, MPs who raise the issue will say, but we know that these laws will be discriminatory in their application. We know that these immigration laws and these data retention laws will be used disproportionately against Muslim people, against people of colour, We know that the laws that are constantly being rolled out by the New South Wales Police, for the benefit of the New South Wales Police, will be used against Aboriginal people, will be used against young people, will be used against homeless people and marginal people. And I tell you, the majority get it. The government of the day gets it. And that's why they're okay with it. And that's why the majority in our population is okay with it. Because they know that at the heart, these are governments that are putting these laws to target the other, and they're comfortable.